Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the day. We have quite a nice attendance. Otherwise, on a conference, the morning session is always the one that is really hard to get attendance to. This is a really interesting roundtable, and we have three great speakers. Oh yeah, I should introduce myself. So I'm Alexandra Arnton. I'm the moderator for this session. I am an economist at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. So it's a little bit earlier here. The session today is the place of the worker time reduction in the Green New Deal propositions and initiatives for climate, how to help people in the transition to work time reduction. We have three great speakers. They're slightly different than the program because we had some people who in the last minute couldn't join us, and we've had some great speakers jumping in and taking their place. So our first speaker is Christoph Schneider, which coordinates the programmatic work of the Democracy in Europe movement 2025 on technological sovereignty, and been part of the working team on the Green New Deal for the Europe proposal. So a really good starting sort of position for this session. Then we will have our second speaker, Will Strong. Will is one of the co-founders of Autonomy and is the director of research. Autonomy has been involved in developing the Green New Deal Europe proposal. So he's going to continue on Christoph's discussion and talk a little bit on post-growth and green growth in the context of the Green New Deal. Our third speaker is Martin Scheideven, and is a member of the European Parliament representing Germany. He's a member of the Linke, or the Left, and is co-chair of the European United Left Nordic Green Left parliamentary grouping. So I am sure that this is going to be a really great session, and I am happy if Christoph, are you ready to start your talk?
I am. Thanks, Alexandra, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Let me start by saying I jumped in yesterday in the evening, so the talk might not be as round as some other talks that you heard at this conference, but I'll give you an insight into the Green New Deal for Europe, and I'll do also something which is based on my professional role as a sociologist. I work in technology assessment, and I do research on the importance of visions of the future for technological innovations, but also for the politics of innovation. So how we as a society deal with future visions. And from that perspective, I'm also like, I will take like a bird's eye view on the Green New Deal, and say a few words about the importance of visions in society. Okay, so I'll share my screen.
Yeah, hold on. I think Torildor needs to stop sharing her screen, but we're just trying to get to that before you start sharing yours, Christoph.
No, you can start,
okay,
Christoph. We will overrun it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we have some technical problems where our technical organizer is having her computer frozen. But I mean, it's one of those things. So
I think you can try, Christoph, to share your screen. It would work technically.
Okay,
so.
I am currently sharing my screen.
No, because she's first. Okay, we'll try to do that as soon as we can. And just Alexandra,
right.
just explain why Pierre and David are maybe not present today, if you can.
I will do that. So okay, so we have someone who is seeing Christoph's slides. All right, we'll just take a session. So we had to other speakers who were originally supposed to be with us. We had David Adler, who sadly couldn't join us because he was supposed to be flying back from oh god, I should really have that in front of me. He was supposed to fly back from Bolivia, and his flight was cancelled one day before he was supposed to fly back because of airstrikes, and he sadly therefore had to say that he cannot participate because he's stuck in a place where he doesn't have Wi-Fi and wasn't able to join us. Then we had Pierre, who was also supposed to be a speaker today. He had to contact us at midnight last night, tell us that since he's the general rapporteur on the budget for the European Parliament, and the budget for the Green New Deal, they have been informed that financial package must be in by next Wednesday. So he was given a very strict timeline in the very, very close to, yeah, of course, next Wednesday. So sadly, he had to bow out in the last minute. They're both really sorry, but we are gonna continue with the session as best as. Right. So Christoph, it seems like we're having some issues for you to share your screen. Some people seem to be seeing it and some people not.
Okay. Shall I try to do it again? Stop.
Yeah.
Start
So
again?
I think you will just continue your presentations because we have a lot of our attendees who managed to see it without any problem. So
okay, all right.
Just continue your presentation. Thank you so much, and sorry.
Okay. So here we go. So yeah, I said I will kind of switch the perspective between sociologist and activist, and let me start with the sociologist. Oh, no. Okay. Before I start about the Green New Deal for Europe, which is one specific campaign that champions the Green New Deal idea, I think it's important to consider that there is no single Green New Deal on the globe. It's like we have multiple Green New Deals and also in different forms. I'd like to talk about 3 forms today. One is it's kind of a new policy paradigm. I think that has made it very popular. Then it's also something taken up by social movements to energize themselves and in a way to do social movement work based on the idea of a Green New Deal. And on a more general level, we could say it's an evolving visionary discourse that talks about desirable futures and in a way, therefore, also helps us to understand our present better by looking at what might be a better future out of the climate crisis. Oh, okay. Keyboard doesn't work, so mouse. Policy paradigm. The Green New Deal kind of became popular through Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey having this proposal in US Congress in 2018. However, as a policy paradigm, it's older than that. The wording Green New Deal appeared around the financial crisis of 2008. Economists in the UK took, in a way, the slogan and formulated a proposal for the UK how to get out of the financial crisis by investing in green industry and green jobs. And yeah, some other discussions took place then, but this made it very popular in 2018. And also in the past 10 years of Green New Deal debate, a very important thing has always been the referencing back to the original Green New Deal in the 1930s in the USA as kind of an historic example, and also to learn from the strategies and tactics of that time. And basically, the actual Green New Deal, or the policy ideas, are a break with neoliberal ideology to a larger or to a lesser extent. I think it's a very challenged paradigm. And I think the core idea is use the state and the state's resources to invest in new infrastructures and in a new economy. And infrastructure and economy should be green, in a way, protect the environment, protect the climate. So it's a clear break with, in a way, letting the markets make the decisions, let the financial private corporations rule the world, towards let's reconsider the importance of public investment in the future. And also, like in this policy paradigm, this idea of investment can have very broad aims, from, in a way, smaller aims, like use it as a green stimulus now after the COVID crisis, for example, or more ambitious goals like, yeah, let's create a sustainable and democratic economy by doing this as well. And in a way, at least the wording somehow found its way into the European Union as well. There's a European Green Deal. Important, the new is left out of the branding, and I think also out of the policies. Yeah, then there's a debate whether Joe Biden actually also takes some Green New Deal ideas or not. So, but it's very important to see that this is actually a very impactful paradigm. And we're, in a way, also mainstream politics is talking about ideas and aspects of a Green New Deal or a Green Deal. So it's much more than only a vision or a conversation. But importantly, it's not only something that happens in established political institutions, but it's also something that happens in social movements that have been quick to take either the slogan up or actually have been involved in further developing the concept, like in the Green New Deal for Europe campaign. Yeah, and I think for social movement, it's both. It's on the one hand, it's a transformative narrative. It's a Green New Deal that helps us to understand a bad old order, the bad old deal in a way, and can claim we need a new deal for society, politics, and the economy. Yeah, we see, for example, the Sunrise Movement in the USA, campaigns on green jobs for all. There's a debate on an international Green New Deal that goes beyond nation states and the European Union. And for example, in Germany, there's a campaign that has not the wording Green New Deal, but talks about a new economic miracle. And the economic miracle was the 50s in Germany, in a way, also a time that was very influenced by the New Deal in the US, but helped, in a way, Germany recover after the war. So they use this framing, but it's similar, going back to the past to envision a better future in a way. I'll give you some details about and some insights about what happens in such a Green New Deal campaign or in a social movement. And yeah, I was partly involved in the Green New Deal for Europe campaign, therefore I can say a few words about this. So the Green New Deal for Europe campaign came out of the Democracy in Europe movement, where we, since 2016, we have been developing visions and ideas and political alliances to make the European Union more democratic. And yeah, we've been early to champion a Green New Deal for the European Union. But then in 2019, after the European Parliament election, this campaign was started, and other activists, organizations, think tanks, researchers were invited and luckily also joined in a way the further definition of what a Green New Deal in Europe would look like. Then Will was involved. He will say his perspective on that later on. Also, very importantly, actually, the Green New Deal group was involved, and they were the economists around 2010, I guess, in the UK, who developed the first, in a way, policy framework of the Green New Deal. Anne Pettifor is very known. She's in that group. So yeah, we're lucky to have a lot of institutional and brain power going into that vision. And basically it was a collaborative effort to write a vision and to be very explicit about what this could look like, because it's also based on this understanding of the Green New Deal, that it's so urgent that we have a systemic transformation of politics, economy, and our society, that in a way we cannot wait for better times to emerge, but we have to be able to use existing institutions, existing processes to engender transformative change. And therefore it's like both. It has this visionary aspect, but there's also a lot of policy detail in it. It's a very long document, around 120 pages, as you can imagine, with so many authors and movements being involved. So I will only focus on the core ideas, that the 10 pillars, and basically what was key to writing this Green New Deal for Europe was that the aim was to combine social justice in the ideas of social justice and organizations concerned with social justice, with environmental justice, and with democracy, or in a way aspirations for democratization. So pillar 1 is meeting the scale of the challenge. I already said something about that. We need to be very quick in engendering such a transformation, and we need to be ambitious and bold and big, because it's not like, you know, a carbon tax will not solve this. It's much more. So yeah, pillar 2, pressing idle resources into public service. That's the public investment part. It's suggested in the document that in a way there could be European investment bonds used by the European Investment Bank, which have a public purpose, that is social justice, environmental justice, climate protection. And they would be, in a way, they would soak up private capital, but then turn it into a public use. And therefore, this is the idea that we have actually a lot of idle resources. We just need the political direction that we give to capital. Pillar 3, empowering citizens and communities. That's the democratic aspect. A core idea is that this money should not only be allocated in Brussels, but it should be given to communities and towns and cities all over Europe, so that they can then democratically decide how to spend that money into climate protection and social justice. There's a job guarantee in it, which is tied to the shortening of the working week. I guess Will can say more about this later. Raising the standard of living through doing this, so improving the quality of public life, improving the quality of infrastructure. It's about fostering equality and also entrenching it in these new infrastructures and institutions that would come up in the process. It's about investing in the future. I said that, and here, like Alexandra already said, like I do mainly, in a way, digital politics, and this is also the part where we put in ideas about democratizing digital infrastructures. And I think this is also very important. Because it shows, like, in such a Green New Deal vision, I think it's important to not only go with in a way, with the mainstream ideas of what is ecologically sustainable or socially just. But we need to think really about the New Deal, and think about all the systemic challenges that we face. And in a way, digitalization is clearly one of them, and it needs a New Deal as well. Also in terms of ecology, like it's a very wasteful industry that is extremely tied to fostering consumerism and in a way degrading democracy. So it's very important to also have systemic change in the digital arena. Then it's about the vision that we go away from endless growth towards, in a way, well-being as a key indicator of the economy. It's about much more than just looking at the European Union. It's about seeing the European Union as an institution that is also responsible for climate justice around the world. And Pillar 10, very close to Pillar 1, committing to action today. So I'll be more of the sociologist again at the end of my talk. And it's very like, you find so many books, and also good books by now, that mention or champion the idea of a Green New Deal. We have the social movements, I talked about that. You see it appearing in the media increasingly. We have a panel in this conference now that we talk about the Green New Deal and shortening the working time. There are right-wing ideologues that worry about Stalinism coming back. And so I think this is extremely important, that it's not just policy and activist working group stuff, but that it's actually going into a public arena, and that we have it as a visionary discourse. However, I think there are still some challenges that I'd like to discuss also in this panel. Visions are extremely important. In a way, our present is in many ways the result of visions in the past, and visions about how to structure policy and the economy. For neoliberalism, you could say, it was also a visionary ideology to break in the US, to break with the New Deal, but also something, that made clear, you will have more liberties, you will have globalization and more individualization. So in a way, also based on such a vision, Thatcher, she was very successful in winning over the young voters in the 80s. And in a way, I think a Green New Deal needs to win over people, and it needs to be a force that helps us to foster societal and political imagination. So, and I think if we only see it as this policy thing, it's not enough. It needs to be a generative idea, out of which more activities and more ideas and more visions come into being in a way. And I think strategy-wise, it's very important to build bridges across political traditions and also political domains, institutions, movements, everyday life, research. In a way, I'd like to see the Green New Deal discourse become mainstream, and maybe less detailed, because I think it needs to be tangible in everyday life. And currently, it's still a very intellectual, academic policy discourse that is sometimes difficult to understand. And how could it become more tangible? I think key is really reframing the economy, the purpose, the moral aspects of what makes a good economy. But it also needs to have something more, not only words, but it needs to be able to create experiences, lived experiences, for examples, that you can point to, like cities or regions that have successful projects that you could frame as Green New Deal projects in a way, because they show us what could be possible in a new societal contract in a way. So I think this is the task.
sorry, this is super interesting, and I love all of these ideas. Would you be able to summarize that in
Yes.
a minute or so?
Yeah, excellent, because that's just my last slide. How do I summarize it? So I think Green New Deal is a very hopeful and promising vision that has been able to transcend domains already. It's in policy, it's in social movements, it brings together different actors with different traditions, and we need to build on that. But I think it needs to become a powerful story and not only a lot of policy ideas.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think exactly taking that, what you said is a sort of intellectual idea and making it mainstream is such an important point. I want to remind our participants that you can ask questions during the speaker's time using the Q&A button in the bottom of the screen. We will have one more speaker and then we will start addressing some of those questions. But please write down the question that comes up in your mind, and we'll have a great discussion after our next speaker. Will, are you ready?
Yeah. Great, yeah, thanks. And thanks, Christoph, for being the super substitute for our talk. It's been a really good conference so far, and I'm looking forward to this afternoon's sessions. So I'm the Director of Research at Autonomy. We're a research organization based in the UK, and we helped organize this conference alongside some other great organizations. And I think it's really heartening to see that a number of 4-day-week campaigns are kind of popping up around Europe. And I think there's a way in which the Green New Deal and all the different initiatives that Christoph already pointed to the fact there's various Green New Deals going around. I think there's an opportunity to kind of dovetail 4-day-week campaigns and Green New Deal initiatives, not just because ideologically they are in sync, but also because practically there is a growing kind of momentum behind both of these initiatives. I think it could be useful for there to be some kind of collaboration. I think conferences like this are an opportunity for us to kind of think through what that might be. Now, the original New Deal in the US, Roosevelt's New Deal, was partly driven by someone called Frances Perkins, who she came from the labor movement in the US, was one of Roosevelt's kind of most dear advisors, basically. And for the longest amount of time, I believe she held some kind of record for the longest time in the cabinet or in the office out of all advisors. Now, she came from the labor movement. She came from a kind of a worker-oriented background, and it's kind of seen that she was one of the main drivers of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which basically was the act which limited working hours to 40 hours a week. So that was one of the first times that, as one of the major pieces of legislation within Roosevelt's New Deal, which basically reduced the working week or put a cap on the working week, as it were. Prior to this, US labor movements have been campaigning for many years, and I think that pressure, the pressure of trade unions trying to reduce the working week throughout the 30s and the post Great War period, really was expressed in this kind of legislation. So Frances Perkins was really an expression of a large a large amount of labor activity in the years before. In the UK, labor movements had basically been pushing for shorter working weeks right back to the Factory Acts in the 19th century. And so that pressure was really, really important to achieve any kind of working time reduction after World War I, then ultimately after World War II as well. And so all that's to say that basically that the Green New Deal really does need to have labor movements behind it. And that's not to say that they can be the only actors. I think that's not necessarily true today, but the labor movement really has driven that historically. Now, since the original New Deal, it's been about 80 years. How far has progress come in terms of working time reduction? it's not been great, to be honest. There's been a big stalling of working time reduction across OECD nations. Obviously, we should mention the fact that in the global south, working time is working hours are off the charts. But in terms of a kind of easily tracked progress from let's say the original New Deal in the 1930s to now, there's been very little progress, a real stalling, particularly since the 1980s. Now, as Christoph mentioned, this is obviously the time of the emergence of kind of neoliberal governmentality, a neoliberal form of economic governance, where things like working time reduction really do go off the menu, and that's partly because of the kind of smashing of worker power, both in the UK and the US, but also we see that decline in countries around Europe as well. So I think to some extent, the Green New Deal is an opportunity, clearly an opportunity to really get these issues back on the agenda. And I think we should hold those advocates of a Green New Deal to account around the issue of working time. So, it's quite clear that working time is whether you have a job and you work too much, whether you don't have a job and you're looking for work, so you don't have enough working time, whether you're self-employed or employed under an employer. Working time is an issue, basically, and there are all sorts of different desires and needs and so on. Any New Deal would need to reckon with this fact. So on the one hand, so Christoph mentioned multiple crises that we're facing. Obviously, the crisis of precarity, of the kind of flexibilization of the labor market. All these issues need to be kind of part of a New Deal. But I'm basically saying here, I think part of this conference, we need to make sure that working time reduction and caps on working hours and reducing overwork are definitely part of a Green New Deal package. Now, I think the Green New Deal is an opportunity, partly because, yes, it's historically, following the lineage of the New Deal, it kind of follows in that tradition, but also pragmatically, it's actually something, as Christoph said, is really, really blowing up all over the world. So as a vehicle, the Green New Deal is very, very important for us to engage in, I think, particularly those who are advocating for working time reduction. Now, I think I want to make two comments, and I think we can move to discussion after this. I think there's a slight tension with the Green New Deal, which we have to navigate as a political project, basically. So what is this tension I'm talking about? Well, the issue of labor, of the value of labor. On the one hand, any Green New Deal needs to tap into an existing common sense of society, an existing kind of work-focused orientation in society, and that means engaging in a discussion about job creation. Job creation on a mass scale, transitioning from industries, from fossil fuel and carbon intensive industries to green industries, things like care, which are non-carbon intensive, but also greening the environment. So things like rewilding and new forms of renewable energy and so on. But on the one hand, we have to lean into this kind of discourse, this create jobs. That's precisely the kind of the historical situation we're in. But of course, we want to talk about what kind of jobs. So I'm pleased to see that the Green New Deal initiative, so Green New Deal for Europe initiative, as Christoph said, is a huge long document, fairly comprehensive, has included the definition of a good green jobs being something with reduced hours. So that's 30 hours, 32 hours, and so on. But I think it's an opportunity for us to try and bake in that as a new standard for what counts as a good job. We shouldn't necessarily just kind of continue with treating jobs as a kind of black box, as to, yes, that's just good to have a job. We should actually be, in 2020, by this point, we should be able to define what we think is a good job, what we think a job should do for people as a means to an end, rather than just an end in itself. I think partly the reason why we often have to settle for less in today's political climate is because we're always under fire for the threat of unemployment, the threat of kind of flexibilization is often making us just kind of settle for a job per se. But I think the Green New Deal for Europe, and the Green New Deal in general, has to really push that. So I think the tension between both, on the one hand, just saying, leaning to the jobs discourse, and also making sure that we have some kind of kind of caveat that actually, yes, jobs are good because they provide an income, but ultimately, jobs are a means to a good life. So I think that fight that struggle needs to happen. There's also a second tension, which I think revolves around growth, basically. Now, I think, we talked a little bit about this yesterday in the session on post-growth. There's obviously competing perspectives around degrowth, post-growth, green growth, And then somewhere in the middle there is the Green New Deal. Now, again, to some extent, the Green New Deal advocates need to, in order to speak the language of the present day, the kind of generally accepted mainstream language, we need to speak in terms of growth. So, you know, the Green New Deal could create X, billion pounds of investment, or it could be, create X, million jobs and so on. But we do actually need to think about to what extent, as a society, we need to degrow certain things, degrow certain industries, and grow certain others. There's a great series in the New Left Review, the kind of quasi-academic journal in the UK. I say quasi because actually it's much more accessible than an academic journal. There's a great debate going on green strategy between those who advocate for green growth, so the idea that we can continue growth but in a green, sustainable manner, and those who advocate degrowth positions. Now, I think it's a really good point made by someone called Lele, who basically advocates the idea that ultimately, for example, the global south does not need to degrow, because ultimately that would not have a net effect really on global emissions. But the global north definitely does need to degrow in certain ways. Our production and consumption patterns are clearly unsustainable. And so in some sense, we need to kind of navigate within a Green New Deal whether what we're going to degrow. So what, obviously some industries we are going to be scaling back and transitioning workers over. But in some sense, we also need to figure out what industries we're going to grow. And there's a kind of, it's to some extent, it's not been my remit, but to kind of map and scale and give a timeline for how much growth in certain areas, renewable energy, kind of like retrofitting and so on, and for how long, basically. So I think ultimately, if it's very easy to fall into a trap of letting growth become yet another end goal, another purpose in itself. But we should really be thinking about, what do we need to grow and for how long, basically. So I think there's, on the one hand, I think, degrowth and post-growth has been around for quite a long time. People like Tim Jackson and so on, very, very influential economists, and that whole tradition is very well established. But ultimately, they've kind of, as far as I can see, kind of failed to really capture the imagination and the political mainstream as the Green New Deal has. So I think the Green New Deal is an opportunity for a very green-orientated, worker-focused project, which ultimately should listen to the concerns of degrowth and post-growth, but is obviously something which actually has some real momentum here. And I think any working time reduction campaign, although working time reduction has been part of degrowth and post-growth for many years, every campaign should really engage with the Green New Deal to some extent and and kind of work through these tensions, basically. What is a good job? How can working time reduction be baked into it? But also, how can working time reduction be part of the kind of scaling back of our carbon emissions and the scaling back of certain industries to an extent as well? Now, I think just a final note on that as well, is I think beyond the kind of necessity, the environmental necessity of working time reduction, which we talked about yesterday in terms of the relationship between working time and carbon emissions, we should also note the fact that working time reduction could also be part of a political project to make it desirable, to provoke a desire for a better life, basically. The Green New Deal needs to be sustainable, it needs to be just, but it also needs to be fun, basically. I think ultimately to say to someone, we're going to be scaling back certain parts of the economy, we're going to have to, we can't live life like we used to, that can provoke anxiety and also the idea that the world's going to get worse. But if you say to someone, we're going to change the way we do things in society, but we're also going to be able to work less, have more time for family, for friends, for things we want to do. This is something I think is a key political ingredient for any project, is to kind of produce that desire, basically. So I think there's ways in which the Green New Deal is a really great opportunity for the working time reduction movement. And so with that, I think we should go to questions and we can kind of talk through some of these things collectively.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Two really good talks about the Green New Deal and really complementary to each other. I feel like you guys were really answering some of each other questions, but we've had a lot of questions coming through during this time, and I'm hoping that we can see both of our speakers, because I think there are some. I'm going to start with some of the more general questions. So one of the main questions that sort of come up in different ways: how can we finance the Green New Deal? could you guys give some more details, some suggestions? And at the same time, a related one, could you guys specify a little bit of some of the more concrete instruments that is suggested within the EU proposal, please? Should we start with Christoph, please?
Yeah, that's very important. The finance, how to finance it question. Basically, the US Green New Deal and what we propose for the European Union are both based on this intellectual tradition of modern monetary theory, which is the idea that basically a state with a certain power within the global economy cannot become bankrupt if it's able to print its own money. And it goes also back to Keynesian economics and other things. So the idea is let's make it very concrete. What we propose in Europe is that basically we look at what the European Central Bank is already doing. They are doing quantitative easing. That means that they're basically creating money, and it's basically almost for free for banks and the banks then decide what to do with the money, and basically the banks does actually create the money by making these decisions, or create in a way capital by making these decisions. And what we say, this should be complemented by public and democratically legitimized decisions on investment. And there could be the EU already has the European Investment Bank, and they already do a lot of ecological and social projects all over the EU. So they get some money from the and so our proposal is, let's use that institution and boost it massively up and link it to the European Central Bank so that it actually can hand out a lot of money. And so this would be then, and the aim would be to, in a way, redirect financial resources from the private capital financial market and have in a way a public institution that is much more powerful in having a mission of what to do with the money. And that's how it would be financed. It would be financed in a way by through in a way public credits, but also the idea is to have investment bonds in Europe. That is, you offer it on the private market. You offer green bonds. So private capital could then invest in these green bonds and get, a certain revenue on it, with an interest rate that is so attractive that, a lot of private capital actors would actually invest in that. And so it would also then soak up private capital, use a public institution to give this private capital a mission, ecological and sustainable and social transformation. And yeah, that's where the money would, in our proposal, come from. But there are other debates, that a Green New Deal would also need to raise taxes because you cannot live endlessly on credit. You need to pay the credit back at some point. So this is ongoing, and I don't think there's the one silver solution. But actually, I often think if you look at what the neoliberal system is already doing with money, it's flowing the globe. That's why we have so many problems. Money is not the problem in my reading. The problem is how to use that money and how to change the decisions made with it.
Great, thank you so much. Will, do you want to make a comment on these questions as well?
On the finance question, no. I think Christoph kind of went through that. It's also not my area of expertise, to be honest. But I think, what was the other question?
Any concrete instruments that the EU are suggesting, or that's been part maybe of the work that you've been part of?
No, I mean, so the way that we fed into the Green New Deal for Europe was to kind of define, you know, the kind of what a job guarantee, which includes a working time reduction, would be. That's not come from the EU. I don't know if Christoph wants to can respond to that. It's not my area, to be honest.
Okay, no, that's fine. I think there's been quite a lot of questions, so we can. One other question was that sort of the historic New Deal had a strong focus on public employment programs, and has partly been touched upon in the talks. But part of the appeal is where workers are worried of losing their jobs, and how does this relate to the demand for work time reduction?
Well, I think there's a unique opportunity for public sectors around Europe and the world, basically, to kind of become, like a new gold standard for what employment is, basically. And that's because obviously the public sector has greater control, or let's say the governments have greater control over the public sector in terms of working conditions, working practices, and so on. And typically, just speaking from the UK experience, that the public sector has always been a bit of a pioneer of decent working conditions, decent pay, and so on, decent pensions and so on. So I think if we're talking about the next stage of creating good work, good jobs, then the public sector has a really huge role to play. And I think the public works programs of the original New Deal can be an example for, I think in the chat, you can see Aidan talking about, like what would the equivalent Green New Deal, what the Green New Deal projects be? Well, we have rewilding, we have, you can have a huge care service that's necessary. I think it's, sometimes the Green New Deal can become a bit of an umbrella for all the good things we want. I think it kind of makes sense. Like as Christoph said, what's the New Deal part? The care service, that huge infrastructure that's needed there, that can be an ongoing public works program. Does it? I mean, we're seeing right now during COVID that if you outsource these services, any kind of public service to a private sector provider, it's really not going well. And do we really want to hand over our care needs to private sector and the kind of market forces? Probably not. We will need a huge public infrastructure program. And of course, care work, and just to take that example, to continue with that example, care work is often badly paid, very stressful, and you get a lot of burnout. Now, I think this is a perfect sector if you're going to create a new gold standard for employment, to have reduced hours, greater employment numbers, and a kind of a care service that other countries look at and say, oh, like look how they do it there. Right now, we look at the Buurtzorg system in Holland, and we often in the UK we look to kind of that part of the world, also Scandinavia, to kind of say look at the kind of utopian forms. But wouldn't it be great if countries would have that innovative public works program where working time reduction is baked into it from the get-go? I think that's necessary.
I agree with Will, and I think if you consider the Green New Deal as this vision that comes up against neoliberalism, and then you have the neoliberal world in which we live emphasizes, in a way, private life, overemphasizes private life and the private aspects of the economy. And I think the Green New Deal ties very strongly to social democratic traditions that see, in a way, the state as a key actor in shaping the economy and creating a more progressive society, in a way. And I think we need to also reconsider what is public life, and not only job, not only see jobs as a part of a newly of a newfound, in a way, public endeavor and public life and public purpose, which and in a way, and to go away from this overemphasis of the private aspects of our lives. And I think this could be one thing. And what I also think is that we not only have like employment and, in a way, the private economy and the public sector, but especially with the digital world that we live in now, a lot of areas are coming into being that are based on commons, where people can do stuff, something important, something less important, but you know, where we would also need a lot of free time to make actually to embrace these new opportunities to do things outside of wage labor, or and maybe things that have a public purpose as well, you know. Democracy, research, innovation.
We just got a question that is very sort of relevant to what you just said, that both of you have sort of emphasized the needs to create jobs that are creating well-being, well-being and environmental sustainability. What kind of mechanisms do you think or can be used to create these kind of jobs, especially at looking at the different scales of the economy? We have local, national, multinational, and linking that to another question, which is that the original New Deal focused a lot on these traditional male jobs. I know, Will, you just spoke about the care economy, but is there another gendered aspect to work in Green New Deal? I mean, we don't just want women to stay within care work. Two hard questions, but
yeah, no, I think you know, an obvious mechanism. I think it, you know, this conference has shown an obvious mechanism for maintaining and creating and deciding what jobs you know, get created and what kinds of jobs these are, is a trade union, basically. So in terms of like a tool, a real mechanism for change, and traditionally has been trade unions based. And I think obviously there's people have found frustration with large unions being very slow and moving towards Green New Deal perspectives, but it is happening in the UK and also across Europe. And we heard yesterday IG Metall, kind of one of its main impetuses or imperatives behind its working time reduction campaigning is to transition from certain industries into greener ones. And so I think the short answer is at different scales, local and national, trade unions should always be in the conversation, alongside policymakers and those and various forms of expertise as well. And I think that conversation should also happen with local communities though as well, right? Like we've seen deindustrialization happen over the last 30-40 years, where there's been literally no control over how an industry comes and goes from a particular location, and that can ruin lives for generations, basically. You know, you have huge antidepressant use and so on and so forth in communities across Europe where they've just had livelihoods taken away. So you need to have that engagement, obviously. In terms of the gendered nature of work, yeah, I think it's an opportunity basically to try and have a kind of wipe away a lot of that those kind of gendered roles. I think from my perspective, I think often the gendered nature of work is often the division between unpaid and paid work. I think for better or for worse, there's often been what's called the feminization of work, in terms of basically both genders are now finding out what it means to have bad jobs. I think traditionally women have, and still are, mainly in part-time work and also been lower paid, but the labor markets have become so withered and deteriorated that actually it's becoming more of a common condition. The real inequality is really about time use outside of work as well. So I think it is an opportunity to wipe away the vestiges of basically a kind of patriarchal gender roles in terms of what kind of work. And I think the care work thing is a real opportunity to do that, because if you provide decent, well-paid care work, then to the extent that we have, I'm talking about the UK as a particularly bad example, but obviously it's around across Europe as well. If you introduce decent employment, doing something which is socially orientated, and loads of well-paid jobs, basically, then I think you will start seeing it populated by both men and women. And so I think that's one way of doing it. And Juliet Shaw mentioned this yesterday, right? It's about basically creating better paid roles in traditionally what was understood as women's work. I think you'll see that kind of material incentive will help greatly. It won't destroy kind of gender inequality, but I think it will really help, because then ultimately, then if you can start earning to provide for yourself and a family, that's to some extent going some way to thinking to kind of like what some, perhaps more traditionally minded would see as a dignified work, basically.
Yeah, let me add to that. I think I completely agree with Will that it's also important to reimagine what is purpose, what is the purpose of work, what is socially useful work. And actually, I think where a Green New Deal vision and also working time reduction could also tie in is the conversation that we find in ourselves now with the coming economic crisis out of the Corona pandemic. At least in Germany, we have this discussion about what are system relevant jobs. And they, the initial thing was, yeah, they are the jobs where people needed to work when everyone was on the sofa. And yeah, people in the supermarket, people in care, people driving public transports, things like that. And I think, when we think about the economy that in a way is sustainable on Earth, we need to have in a way a needs-based economy, I think, which has in a way democratic mechanisms in deciding what are the needs that we want to focus our economic energies on. And in a way, this conversation is ongoing. And I think, when you look into that, these are not the 60, 70 hours investment banker jobs, or, the stuff that David Graeber also has been writing about, all these bullshit jobs where people also feel that it's unnecessary what they do, but most or many of them get a decent wage, So, and many others, who feel a great purpose in their work, face shit working conditions. And so, economic crisis plus looking for new orientation, symbolic meanings. I think this could be the moment now to to set this off, and not as a defensive thing, as a defensive narrative, but actually as a in a way a very energizing and engaging and empowering narrative. That our lives will get better if we work less and have a more sustainable economy.
I think that's an incredibly positive spin on what's a really hard situation for a lot of people. Thank you for that. We have a question here that is sort of building a little bit on that democratic, because a lot of you guys have been talking or sort of echoing this sort of democratic idea of a Green New Deal. So a Green New Deal will be a massive infrastructure project led mainly by the state in a lot of, especially in the starting point. So, and in this question is sort of comparable to the nationalizations and expansion of the state post World War II. So, is there any tensions between this idea of a democratic vision of a Green New Deal and the actual necessary mobilization of the sort of central state operations? And in that case, how can we overcome this sort of conflict?
I'll let Christoph go first this one because I keep jumping in.
Okay, feel free to jump in, Will. Yeah, my answer to that is, I think this depends on the power constellations. What we will be able to orchestrate outside of the state to shape this state. At least, let's hope that states increase this stuff and do it more. And I think this already needs a lot of political mobilization. But then what we in the Green New Deal for Europe campaign clearly emphasize is it should be a transformation of the state itself, and we need to have, broad coalitions and social movements that are able to voice these demands outside of the state and outside of parliaments. And I know, and I mean, this is also the tension is I think within the debate, there are some weaker versions of the Green New Deal which say, yeah, okay, state investment in green economy, that's it. where and some stronger versions, and this really depends on politics in a larger sense, I guess.
I think yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think I'd like to think, and we should really aim for us to move beyond that dichotomy. I think that's where the question was going, basically, between big state kind of mobilizations and democratic engagement. But it's tough because we've had basically decades of a kind of people being so far from power, so far from democratic control, that it's almost, you know, it'll take a certain amount of integration so that process kind of becomes much more natural. But I think it has to happen, basically. I think ultimately there was something which happened with the Labour Party in the UK in the last election. They released these kind of regional manifestos, and I think there's something in that which is kind of there needs to be huge state projects. There needs to be parameters set by the state in terms of our, you know, resource output and our kind of carbon emissions and so on and so forth, and how many wind farms we need to make, and etc., and how much care work we need to kind of allocate. But then I think that can be taken down to a much more local level, where this is the remit. You know, each region will have their own specificities in terms of what their capacity is. So they're much more rural regions, much more city-based regions. And I think basically you can have that engagement beyond just focus groups. It's a huge effort, but I think the state should basically do that, because that's how you get a population on board with the new industrial strategy. Basically, as far as I can see, that's how you integrate such a huge change that we need to ultimately achieve. I think you have some kind of halfway house between, here's the agenda we need, and we're going to go out there and win that argument and convince you of that. But you're going to be involved in discussions as to, you know, what can be done in what's ideal in your particular region, what is, you know, kind of what's required in terms of X, Y, and Z, and lots of local knowledge. Remember that there's that great book by James Scott called Seeing Like a State, which I would recommend, although it's written in 1998. I think it's still very relevant, where it talks about utopian state projects and how they failed before, basically. And often it's because it's very hard to integrate local knowledge into a state project. But I think ultimately that's something which can mitigate some of the more heavy-handed, blunt state instruments, and also create that buy-in from local populations. So I think having, you know, much more on the ground knowledge, I think it's probably much more possible now with various different technologies and with that understanding. So I think it's a really important question, and ultimately one which needs to have that engagement rather than simply top-down mobilization, but equally requiring that it's not just up to local authorities to sort it out themselves. I think there does need to be a certain state responsibility there.
I think you're right. I think actually that is one of those things that technology really have helped, because before it was either one or the other, but now we can have that sort of overarching steering of this project, almost to speak, but still have the interaction at different levels. I'm going to let Margareta Steinrücke come in and make a comment. Adrian, if you could give her speaking rights, please. It's always a bit exciting with new technologies as well to make everything work.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yes, I'd like to make 3 points. First, I would like to remember that the original New Deal also already had some real strong working time reduction demands. Some of the Democratic senators in this time proposed really to go to the 30 hours week. And this was hindered by the massive resistance of the employers and her organizations. But anyway, they realized the reduction from 48 hours to the 40 hours in this time. And this is not few. No? So I think the Green New Deal today could more directly connect to the old New Deal in this question too. And I think in all the debates on post-growth and how to come really to an attractive other model of living and of economy, I think Christoph said already that the aspect of vision is very important to as a driver for winning people, and I think we really have to use time as a concrete part of utopia, and that we have to come in a point that the currency of the economy today, it is money or consume, and that we come to the alternative that free time is the lead currency, that people really have the feeling they win anything when they don't consume so much, and because they don't have to work so much, and that we make this narrative strong. Okay, this is the one thing, and the other thing is always the question with the working places, and we have the problem that many of the jobs who are now in the really environment destroying industries, like coal plants, like automotive industry, etc., that they are really the best paid industrial jobs. And when we want to propose the people, please leave this destroying environment, destroying jobs, and make something in the care work or in the public traffic, for example, then we have really to at least we have to support the trade unions fighting in these branches to bring up the wages and to make better the working conditions in these branches. At the moment, we have this stupid discussion on system-relevant professions in the Corona crisis, and the applause. And actually, we have a collective bargaining round of Verdi. This is the trade union for the services, also for the public services. And the people working in the hospitals and working in the public traffic, the employers say no, they don't want to pay anything more, even when they applauded in the Corona crisis. It's crazy, and this is such a hard struggle. And I think first we have to fight this struggle to better up this not industrial jobs. And also, I think a Green New Deal has to explain, as already Will mentioned, much more concrete in every local community or region, where are the green jobs, really with facts, with payment, and so on. really make concrete plans, no? Only to say, oh, when we will introduce the Green New Deal, there will be 1 million jobs for the climate. This is fine, but so general, nobody will move for that. No? And this is, I think, one big task we have now as green lefts, let's say, to show that, completely.
I think that is some really, really good points, and I think that really echoes or how do you say, really complements some of the things that we heard from both Christoph and Will. And thank you so much. I think I would like to link another question from one of our participants into some of what we've been saying here, which is because the focus here is, of course, work time reduction. And we had the comments now that the old deal did suggest, as Margareta said, the old deal did suggest that we needed to focus on work time reduction and really trying to create that feeling that free time actually is a currency, is something that we need to focus on. But a lot of critics of the Green New Deal have said that it actually would require a massive expansion of labor. So they basically say that, well, a Green New Deal will require a lot more working time rather than less. Any sort of any comments to this?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a danger. There's always a danger in our societies that we overwork and we double up work and so on and so forth. But I guess what we're talking about here is a transition. And I think there's a few things to say in a way. So we're talking about, on the one hand, transitioning industries. So that's like reallocating labor. But on the other hand, existing labor. On the other hand, there's also, potentially more innovative ways to kind of tie in seasonal work. So say, rewilding might have to happen, in different working patterns to like normal kinds of work. So you might, for example, have students, instead of working in whatever, retail in their summer holidays, they might be doing rewilding, or they might be plugging into green projects in a much more kind of like dynamic way, well paid and so on and so forth, but still kind of like having different new kinds of labor, and reallocating those who are typically not counted in labor markets. So obviously students don't count as they count as those outside of employment, right? So in a way, I think it's although there's plenty of work to be done, I think this is the importance of transitioning from the industries which we've been talking about, but also of kind of creating opportunities for people to be involved on terms which work for workers. So I think I'm not entirely convinced by the idea that we need an army we need like a really militarization of labor power in order to kind of reach our green targets. I think there's a mixture of scaling back, reallocation of labor from different industries, and obviously, I do think there's a role to be played of new technologies as well. So I think it's a slightly kind of austere vision of the future, where ultimately the only way we can figure out how to move to a green future is basically lots of people putting in loads and loads of toil. So I think it's not as bleak as that, basically.
Yeah, I also think it's difficult to talk about the final stage of a Green New Deal in 20 years. But I agree with Will, what we need to focus on is the transition now, how to get a transition going. And what your comments about reallocating labor reminded me of a debate that I followed when we wrote the Green New Deal paper, which was about that it's not enough, and there was good research supporting that it's not enough to simply, in a way, foster renewable energies. Because if you only foster the renewable energies, they will go on top of your existing energy mix. And all we do is consume more energy, and energy will, in a way, remain cheap. And so it encourages a growth in energy consumption that basically we cannot afford much longer. So the argument there was, you need to foster renewable energies, but you also need to decrease fossil energies. And maybe, you know, such an argument could also be made about labor time. If we reallocate labor time towards these more necessary and urgent tasks, this needs to go hand in hand with in a way, using, I think actually, and it's not about only using the free will of people on the labor market, but using laws and other things to make certain industries, you know, to what we said before, to degrow them and also degrow the amount of work that goes into them. But yeah, I mean, you know, Anne Pettifor, she's one of the main experts on the Green New Deal. She talks about we need to have a needs-based, localized economy, and this will be very labor intensive. So you find all kinds of positions on labor time in the Green New Deal debate.
Thank you so much. We got a really good comment here from a participant. Remy said that, let's not forget that an important issue of the Green New Deal is the shift from industrial agriculture to biofarming, which requires a lot of manual labor. And this kind of labor is the sort of unqualified labor that is really hard to find at the moment. And I think this has been echoed somewhat a little bit now in the Corona crisis, where we, at least here in the UK, we saw that suddenly a lot of agricultural farmers could not find workers, even though we had a massive increase in unemployment or people who were out of work. So there is probably also a need in some kind of change in social norms, how we're thinking around work. And I think this is one of the really large challenges. We had a question from a while ago, which is asking how we can imagine a democratic plan about what part of the economy needs to be sized down and what needs to grow. But I feel like we have addressed that in a different way. So I would like to look at the question. We can keep that in mind when we're looking at one of our last questions, which is the risk that if we're wanting the Green New Deal to become mainstream and sort of we have this, everyone is on the same track, how can we avoid the sort of hijacking of a deal? When the EU Commission is talking about Green New Deal and it ends up to being just another version of sort of capitalism or green capitalism that has sort of been, I would like to say, used as PR for some parties or organizations lately.
Christoph, I'll let you start with this one.
Yeah, I think actually the scale of the challenge, you know, I think what we face when it comes to climate change is we need civilizational redesign. Systemic, all aspects of our lives in a way will be affected, and the point is, do we manage to shape this democratically, or will it just happen and force us to do things? And I think the big opportunity in light of this challenge could be that maybe the Green New Deal, maybe in 2 years it's something else, you know, the name has changed, but that we look at how can we build the alliances and do the hard work of combining different political traditions, different political actors with different competencies, with different values, sometimes, you know, what they see as the most desirable and the least desirable. I think Green New Deal clearly is something in the progressive side of politics, but also here, you know, it's very important and urgent and hard to build these networks and coalitions and find a shared language that is enough to work together, but is not so strongly shared that everyone wants the same. You know, I think that it cannot work like that.
I agree. It's very difficult. I think there's a problem. There's a problem in terms of it as a signification in a way, because so let's take an example. In the UK at the moment, there was a progressive movement called Build Back Better. They called themselves that, and as a coalition of organizations, I think autonomy was kind of part of it to some extent. Lots of organizations were part of it. And then as soon as the government started using the term Build Back Better, and Joe Biden used it too, suddenly you're in a different situation where you realize you're up strength versus strength. Who can claim and define what that means? And at that point, you know, a right-wing government, a typically neoliberal, but ultimately now maybe becoming a bit like a big state right-wing government, is now defining the terms of Build Back Better, and they probably have more force and greater communication system than even the progressive forces battling it in a way, right? So I think there's a danger of that happening. I think it's less dangerous with the Green New Deal, because ultimately the green part is actually, it's dead against a lot of the lobbying interests which are backing big kind of right-wing states. So in some sense, you know, I know BP tries to look green and so on, but it's quite hard for BP and so on to try and claim the green mantle. They are like quite clearly oil companies. So I think there's always a danger of being co-opted, but that's why it's really important that we actually, it's not necessarily just about detail, but it's about the messaging that this is what a Green New Deal means, and it ultimately message one is change, new. Message two is about, you know, and that newness equates to a whole new, you know, set of provisions for people in society, and then also the green part is that we need to be clear about what it means, and I think that's why it's helpful to have organizations like, even, you know, direct action groups like XR and kind of other kind of slightly more liberal-minded green politicians. There's a whole, as Christoph's saying, a whole constellation of actors which are, it's useful to kind of, you know, put on the agenda like what a Green New Deal does mean and what it doesn't mean. And I think we need to keep that up. Otherwise, there is a real danger that the language can be taken just as we've seen before.
Thank you so much. We are in this interesting situation now. So we are waiting for our third speaker, Martin Schiedevan, and he is currently running late because he's taken a corona test that he could not take at any other point than this morning. And I think that is just reflecting the kind of situation we are in now, where we're having this an online conference. We're trying to talk about work time reduction, even though we're in this situation where a lot of us are working more than ever. Some of us are not working at all, despite really wanting to. And now one of the people who are speaking are slightly delayed because he's taking a corona test, which is given by some of the new identified key workers. So please keep asking questions. We are waiting for Martin and for him. So he will basically, we're going to have some more questions, then he's going to come in and have his talk. So we're almost having like a little bit of two sessions in one. There has been a question regarding a little bit of the global context of a Green New Deal. So we're speaking a lot, of course, about the EU because of our sort of locality. But a Green New Deal, of course, has to incorporate the whole world. And something that is really important in part of this sort of global Green New Deal will be a sharing technology. It's often tends, at least being an economist, it tends to be assumed that this happens automatically, but we see a lot of barriers in real life. Any thoughts? What are the sort of work that is being done there?
I mean, so the thing is that I think Christoph can speak a bit more concretely. I'm not, as I say, it's not necessarily my remit, but I think there's an interesting entanglement between the global, like the relationship between the global south and the global north as being effectively a remnant of colonialism, and some would say still today there being almost de facto colonial relationship going on. So I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about the transfer of different green technologies and knowledge as not as one of exchange, but as one of, to some extent, reparations. Because obviously there's something to be said for the idea that like some global south countries are to some extent kind of jumping over the industrial period, fine, but others are just kind of have been entering it in a slightly in a similar way that some of the global north countries did decades ago. And to the extent that, you know, it's the kind of arrogance of a global north perspective to say, no, you can't do that because we need to save the planet. So there needs to be like a very, very robust industrial strategy, which is working in partnership to make sure that there can be kind of prosperity you know, without and kind of avoiding a new colonial relationship of kind of like policing global south in the global south in terms of its environmental impact. And as I say, I think it's important to remember that basically, you know, it's not in terms of carbon emissions, you know, per capita and so on, the global south is not in need of a drastic degrowth in the same way that the global north is. And in fact, you start seeing some of these proposals for rewilding the globe that actually come from the global north and actually talk about rewilding much of the global south. So there's a real danger in basically forgetting that this kind of history of the global north global south relationship, and we don't want to kind of we don't want to have a quite nihilistic approach, which is effectively saying we sometimes can kind of do away with kind of the global south prosperity in view of kind of keeping environmental limits in place. I think it's a really thorny issue, which I think those things need to be considered basically.
Yeah, the global dimension is absolutely crucial, yeah, I think we also need to debate, you know, the role of institutions like the IMF or something like that. What would they look like as a Green New Deal institution and then not as a neoliberal institution? David Adler, he's actually doing some work on that, so he would be the better guy to answer this question. But I can give you an idea that we have in the Green New Deal for Europe proposal, which is based on this idea of research and technology cooperation and transfer, and so that the European Union comes much more oriented towards, you know, research as a public good and not as a good to foster private economic growth, which is typically the strategy with a lot of patents involved and industry corporations towards, you know, researching these new technologies in a much more public and collaborative and open manner. So that's one aspect. But I think what is also important to consider there is the knowledge transfer from the south to the north. And one example that really struck me was a form of COVID testing that was pioneered in Africa because of the experience they had with other such diseases. Was you know, a testing system where you test 10 pieces at the same time, and only if you get a positive result, you test each of the 10 pieces individually, and therefore you basically increase your efficiency of testing by 10. And I mean, we can see why this was such an idea was not developed in the north, you know, where but I think, you know, this is just one example where I think there's such a load of a wealth of knowledge and approaches to deal with a much more complicated economic and social environment, you know, and that also could benefit us. And I think, yeah, global Green New Deal needs to be the thing, such as similar like neoliberalism when it became a global system, you know.
So just had couple of questions pop up, starting with the one that is building straight on what you spoke about now, Kristen. So basically a lot of green technologies depend on these precious metals that are mined in the global south. And how do we ensure that we don't sort of intensify almost the colonialism that we're trying to move away from, and sort of the pillage of the global south? So I'm just going to let you do a quick sort of reply to that while I have a look at the questions.
Yeah, I'll reply with the words of Thea Riofrancus. She's one of the champions of the Green New Deal in the US, and I was in a session with her a couple of months ago, and she argued that it's urgent that we also define an idea of what she called supply chain justice into Green New Deal policies, such that, you know, particularly the supply chains for the technologies that we need have more oversight, are organized more responsibly, and foster in a way justice. That was her idea on that. Yeah.
Sorry, a question from Marike. Sorry, I'm very bad pronouncing names. So could you elaborate a bit more on how to build up power relations that are necessary for a just transition? So she has a concrete example here. On one hand, we have like 15,000 refugees on Lesbos. They're desperately longing for a decent life and a meaningful job. On the other hand, our farmers don't find workers. How do we make a match and create this new economic reality, meeting the needs of the people and planet? So we need both visionary ideas, but also power. I'm not sure who wants to start. Christoph.
Sorry, I can't find the question. I was okay.
It's on the Q&A button in the bottom of the screen, and then you have from Marike.
Oh right, yeah, okay.
So it's how to build these kind of power relations to create a just transition. I mean,
the second part is the second part of the question is slightly. I mean, we should. I just think just a little caveat to be careful that we don't necessarily want to just say, you know, just it relates to the previous question where it mentioned kind of unqualified agricultural work, and ultimately, I'm not sure any of us have a vision of the future where we say, look, let's get some unqualified agricultural workers and let's continue as we were doing, right? It's quite backbreaking work. It's very low paid. It's not just simply about matching labor to demand, right? We want to make sure that it's well-paid jobs, that, you know, that actually there's certain health and safety rules in place. There's still quite a lot of modern day slavery. I know I'm not saying agriculture is the worst for it, but I'm just saying that it's not simply about matching up, although I do agree that ultimately the overwork and underwork problem does need to be resolved. I just think that we should be careful when we talk about the idea that we need to get as much cheap migrant labor in to do some of the bad jobs. Yeah.
And when it comes to power, I'll restate one of my arguments in another manner. And I think we are in a times of profound disorientation and also ideological breakdown in a way. So neoliberalism does no longer convince, it's just zombie institutions that continue with that stuff. The right has been very successful to draw into that confusion in the past years, you know, emphasizing nationalism, racism, and all this other stuff. And I think power in such a situation needs to also be built as narrative power. We need to be able to tell a story of a desirable future, and this needs to be, you know, become the telling of this story needs to be the process that builds the coalition that makes this story. It's not, it's like chicken and egg, you know, it needs to happen at the same time. That we need to have a lot of voices, but that they engage and see a shared project in a way. And yeah.
Thank you. It's not easy questions. We're basically asking you guys to solve this massive or answer this massive complicated questions, but I think that is giving some real insights. We have a final question. I have just found that Martin is held up. His corona test did not work as smoothly as he was hoping, and he will be unable to come and join this session. I think as I said, we have one more question, but it's also been a really, really great session. I'm so thankful to both of you, Christoph and Will, coming in the late minute and creating this really good conversation around the Green New Deal, really bringing in some insights to what is a massive project, but really exciting. And I think really this excitement has also shown through. So Christoph, you mentioned earlier the work time reduction would or could be combined with the job guarantee program. Is there anything more you could say about this, or is it just a matter of sort of setting a work time limit for job guarantee jobs, then that becomes the maximum that the private sector would need to adjust to?
Yeah, like in the proposal, the Green New Deal for Europe proposal, it's actually public sector jobs tied to a 4-day work week, tied to social and ecological purpose. Yeah, but I agree, you know, if it's not enough to focus on this one policy, and I think, yeah, probably Will is the one to answer this, huh?
Are you...
I mean, I think. Sorry, Alex, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, do you want to make a comment?
I think that a job guarantee, if done properly, this is all the caveats, could be a good thing. I think there are dangers of a job guarantee where, for example, lots of the proposals, particularly coming from those of an MMT, modern monetary theory, background, propose that it's the lowest level job where there's no possibility of raising the wages, creating a kind of reserve army of workers. That's a job guarantee I don't think we want, because ultimately, how can you possibly give people like a low baseline wage? It's going to be unqualified work. What kind of work are these people going to do? I mean, ultimately, you don't want carers to be unqualified. You don't want people working in new environmental technologies to be unqualified. You know, there's a whole range of jobs that we'll need to be well paid and skilled. So I think on the one hand, we need to be wary of that. And on the other hand, we also don't want the jobs guarantee to be somehow a replacement for welfare, which is, again, sometimes part of the proposals, not part of the Green New Deal for Europe proposal, I'd say, but it's just something to keep in mind, that sometimes proposals say, look, there needs to be a job guarantee, and if people refuse the job guarantee, you know, what happens then? So if you say, okay, we can guarantee you a job, it's this job which is very low paid, and it's not something you're not necessarily interested in, can these people still take on social security benefits? And so on and so forth. So I think there are certain things we need to be aware of, and ultimately I think job creation and public works programs and those kind of things where you can produce, you know, generally people want to work, right? People want to have some kind of work, and so you put stuff on the table, and also mechanisms for so people can have access to them. That's what we should be doing, rather than a guarantee becoming something potentially quite grim. And I think the Green New Deal for Europe's proposal for a job guarantee is worded well enough so that it gives options rather than kind of prescribing. So I think that's important.
Thank you so much. And I think that that is some really good concluding comments. Basically, creating a deal that is capturing people's actual, because in reality, people want to work, right? People are excited when they have a job that they find meaningful, and at the same time, trying to sort of create this idea of free time as currency. I really like that sort of comment. And this has been a really great session. Thank you both, Will Strong and Christoph Schneider. Thank you for your speaks, for your interactions, for your comments. We are going to round off this session now, so I'm going to hand over to Adrian. But once again, thank you guys so much.
Thank you for having us.
Alex. Thank you.